When a pope dies, the funeral is solemn. The funeral rite of the popes has been codified over the centuries and has two objectives. The first is to show respect and reverence for the remains of a man who became pope. The second is to show the transience of the human condition. The man who became pope is a man who, from the dust, became the successor of Peter, and who, at the moment of death, performs the greatest act of humility by entrusting himself to the Lord of life, testifying his faith in him, and handing over to others the office received. Since the 4th century, after the funeral rite, the popes have generally been buried in the Vatican, with exceptions, reasons of convenience, particular requests of the pontiff, and even practical reasons. Among Peter's 265 successors, 30 were buried outside of Vatican. Pope Francis, in his spiritual testament, also chose not to be buried in the Vatican. He expressed his wish to be laid to rest in the Basilica of St. Mary Major. The last pope before him not to be buried in St. Peter's was Pope Leo XIII, who requested interment at St. John Lateran.
La tradizione di seppellire I papi in San Pietro non è da...
The tradition of burying popes in St. Peter's does not date back to the beginning of Christianity. We know nothing about the burials of the first 2 centuries. The first popes, up to the 5th century, are buried in the catacombs or some surface monuments. Leo the Great is the first pope to be buried in St. Peter's. From that period on, we have burials scattered throughout the churches of Rome, and then from the end of the 5th century until the 10th century, burials mainly at St. Peter's. The Bishop of Rome is buried where he dies. Bishops who die in Rome are buried in Rome. Sometimes they are also brought to Rome when death occurs outside.
A Roma quando la morte è avvenuta fuori.
Pope Francis chose the Basilica of St. Mary Major for his burial because of his deep personal bond with it. He often prayed before the icon of Salus Populi Romani, especially before and after each apostolic journey. He visited the Basilica on the first day of his pontificate. His final visit occurred on April the 12th, 2025, just days before his passing, when he prayed before the icon on the eve of Holy Week. His connection to St. Mary Major was also rooted in his Jesuit identity. It was here that St. Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Jesuits, celebrated his first Mass. Pope Francis isn't the first pope to be buried in St. Mary Major. The Basilica contains the tombs of Honorius III, Nicholas IV, St. Pius V, Sixtus V, Paul V, Clement VIII, and Clement IX.
All'inizio, nei primi 2 secoli,
In the first 2 centuries, burial is necessarily where the cemeteries are, and the cemeteries are the catacombs that we know today. Afterward, starting in the 3rd century, we have burials on the surface. The first criterion is that of practicality. Where there is a cemetery, the body of the Bishop of Rome must be laid to rest. Over time, we realize that the Bishop of Rome is a special person. Therefore, we have burials in which all the bishops of Rome are placed together. A holy place par excellence.
un luogo santo per eccellenza.
What other churches in Rome house the bodies of the popes? About 90 popes are buried in St. Peter's Basilica, 21 in the Vatican grottos. St. John Lateran is the cathedral of the Pope in Rome, so it's no surprise that many popes have wanted to be buried there. 22, in fact. There are 7 in St. Mary Major, 5 in the Basilica of St. Mary of Minerva, 5 at the Basilica of St. Lawrence outside the walls, 3 at St. Paul outside the walls, and 1 in the Basilica of the 12 Holy Apostles. Among the popes not buried in Rome are Gregory XII, who abdicated before Benedict XVI and is buried in Recanati. Benedict XII and John XXII are in Avignon, France. Saint Celestine V is in L'Aquila, Italy. Blessed Gregory X in Arezzo. Saint Gregory VII in Salerno. And Saint Adeodatus I in Cinto Euganeo. Pope Francis had decided that he would be laid to rest in the Basilica of St. Mary Major, a choice that slightly altered the traditional funeral rites. At the conclusion of the funeral, his body was not taken to the Vatican grottos, as is customary. Instead, the procession moved towards St. Mary Major for his burial. What is, in the end, the meaning of the burial of a pope?
Noi abbiamo i primi secoli che vedono una lista.
During the first centuries, many bishops of Rome are dubbed as saints. When we move, has been changes. When does the veneration of the After the French Revolution, two popes, Pius VI and Pius VII, were arrested and deported into exile. Pius VII even dies as a prisoner in Valencia, France. Pius VII is a prisoner of Napoleon for 5 years, and at that moment, the images, the engravings of the imprisoned popes begin to circulate. The 19th century, considered with the arrival of the Italian government in Rome and the British Italian kingdom, considers himself a prisoner in the Vatican. Newborn Italian kingdom considers himself a prisoner in the Vatican. At that point, what happens? Catholic pilgrims to Rome do not simply come to venerate the tomb of Peter or the tomb of the ancient Roman martyrs, but they come to meet the Pope. And so we come to our days when we also talk about the Papa Boys, the World Youth Days, in which devotion to the Pope, not only dead but living, has become a constitutive element of current Catholicism, a characterizing element.
Il cattolicesimo attuale, un elemento caratterizzante.
In his spiritual testament, Pope Francis requested a simple burial in the earth at St. Mary Major. This beloved basilica will now stand as a place of pilgrimage in memory of a pope marked by humility and profound devotion to the Blessed Virgin.